Dr. Cotton, does that photograph appear to illustrate the banding patterns for 3 different samples that you tested in that proficiency test, namely 57, 58, and 59?
Yes, it does.
With permission, I'd like to put it up on the Elmo.
Yes. I think we need the numbers at the top, Mr. Harris.
Yes, we definitely do.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cotton, if you need to step down, please do. When you did the DNA testing on these 3 different samples, 57, 58, and 59, did you utilize what you earlier referred to in this trial as a single locus cocktail?
Yes, we did.
And that's a situation where instead of simply probing the DNA with one genetic marker, you do more than one genetic marker at the same time.
That's right.
And that's how you produce more than 2 bands in a lane. Is that correct?
Yes.
And next to 57, look down on the lane. Dr. Cotton, is that profile, that the DNA profile that the pointer is pointing at, the DNA profile from sample 57?
Yes, it is.
Okay, could you put that in here? Right. And Dr. Cotton, is that second arrow pointing at the DNA profile representing sample 58?
Yes, it is.
Is that arrow now pointing to sample 58 as well?
Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Cotton, is the third arrow now pointing at the DNA profile for sample 59?
Yes.
Now, in this particular proficiency test, Dr. Cotton, samples 57 and 58 came from one person, correct?
Can I look at the key?
Sure.
Yes, that's right.
And sample 59 comes from a different person.
Well, 59 should have come from a different person.
Right. Okay. Now, when you analyze these 3 samples at Cellmark, were they all processed as part of the same batch?
I think that they were, but since I was not, I wasn't really supervising any work in the laboratory at the time that this test was done. The records, if I remember correctly, indicate that they were processed in 2 separate batches. So it's possible that 59, 58, and 57 were processed at the same time.
Could you return your seat, please?
Sure.
Thank you. And would it be fair to say, Dr. Cotton, that somehow during the processing of these samples, that DNA from either sample 57 or sample 58 was accidentally put into the tube with sample 59?
Yes.
And that mistake led to the false match of 59 with samples 57 and 58. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And wouldn't you agree, Dr. Cotton, that the bands in this false match are as strong and as clear as the bands in the match between Mr. Simpson's sample and item 52 in this case?
Excuse me, objection argumentative, Your Honor, also irrelevant.
Sustain.
Dr. Cotton, with respect to band density and relative band densities, would you agree that the bands in this proficiency test, where you had a false match between 59 and 57 and 58, are as dense as the bands in item 52 in our case?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Sustain.
Just argumentative, is that?
It's irrelevant.
May we have a sidebar, Your Honor?
Proceed.
Did you say earlier during your testimony, Dr. Cotton, that at the time you did the proficiency testing in 1988, 1989, that you were not producing as high-quality autorads as you are currently producing in your laboratory?
Yes, I did.
Given that statement, Dr. Cotton, wouldn't you agree that the banding profile in item 59 and its comparison with item 57 is as high quality a banding pattern as the banding pattern you have comparing 52 with Mr. Simpson's reference sample in this case?
Same objection.
Sustain.
And Dr. Cotton, would you agree that just by looking at the photograph of the autorads in this case, that there is no way, just by looking at them, that you can tell that you had in fact gotten a false match?
Yes, I agree with that.
And would you agree that the reason that you have this false match is because the original sample that was in the tube for 59 was so degraded as to not be observable?
Objection, same objection, same ground.
Overruled.
Also calls for speculation.
Overruled.
I don't think we know whether it was degraded or it was just too small of a quantity.
But both of those explanations could produce a result where you don't see a DNA pattern, isn't that right?
Oh, yes.
And in our case, Dr. Cotton, had the DNA, the original DNA from the Bundy drops, been so degraded due to handling or packaging or processing such that you wouldn't see a DNA pattern in the original sample, and then it was cross-contaminated with Mr. Simpson's reference sample, would you also have this same phenomena?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence, also calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Or would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that this type of phenomena that you observe here for sample 59 can occur whenever the original sample is so degraded that it will not leave a visual pattern and is then cross-contaminated with another sample of DNA?
Same objection, same grounds.
Overruled.
Yes, I would.
And Dr. Cotton, had you then been asked to type a frequency for this particular match, that frequency would indicate a very rare event, would it not?
Objection irrelevant. Also assumes facts not in evidence, calls for speculation.
Are you speaking of 1157, the patterns that are here?
Yes.
Overruled.
Yes, you would type, you would make a frequency, and it would almost certainly indicate that that banding pattern was a rare event.
In fact, Dr. Cotton, for this particular banding pattern, didn't you generate in your report to the CACLD that it had a frequency of approximately 1 in 1.8 billion?
If you're reading from our report, then yes, I know that we generated frequencies. Obviously, I can't remember what the frequency was for a particular pattern.
Please take a look.
Yes, you read it correctly.
And so what you're saying in this particular report is the frequency of that match between item 57 and item 59 occurs in the population with a frequency of approximately occurs with a frequency of approximately 1 in 1.8 billion people. Is that right?
Right, we're saying the frequency of the pattern, not the frequency of the match, but the frequency of the pattern would be for that report it says 1.8 billion.
Well, if this had been a real case, item 57, 58, and 59, and not simply a proficiency test, you would have declared a match between item 57 and 59. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, and we would have also generated a frequency.
And the frequency that you would have generated would have been 1 in 1.8 million, 1 in 1.8 billion people, correct?
Yes.
But in fact, in this particular example, there was a 1 in 50 chance that it was a false positive. Isn't that correct?
Sustained.
Well, was it a 1 in 50 chance that it was a false positive in this particular proficiency test?
Well, Judge, no foundation.
Sustained.
You were given 50 samples to look at, were you not?
Yes.
And on one of the 50 samples...
49.
We got a Collins problem here, Counsel.
Well, let me ask you this simple question then, Dr. Cotton. I hope it's simple. In this particular instance, you said the frequency of the pattern that matched was 1 in 1.8 billion people, right?
That's right.
But in fact, it's a false positive between 59 and 57, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And so the 1 in 1.8 billion would incorrectly create some kind of value to that match, which would be a distortion, wouldn't it?
Objection argumentative, also
Sustained.
irrelevant.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Well, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that since 59 and 57 don't match, it would be wrong to suggest, in that particular instance, that that match is valued at a frequency of 1 in 1.8 billion people?
You keep referring to a value of a match. The frequency doesn't tell you anything except how often you would see this banding pattern. So the frequency is only that. It doesn't say anything more than that. And yes, you are correct. This is a false match. This is an incorrect match. It was caused by laboratory error.
And because it is a false positive match, that number of 1 in 1.8 billion doesn't apply to the frequency of the pattern in lane 59. Isn't that correct?
Objection irrelevant, also misleading.
Overruled.
Well, it still applies to the frequency of that pattern. The frequency of that pattern is whatever it is. In fact, that pattern matches because it's the same DNA as, I actually believe it's 58 that we demonstrated that sample came from. It's like you're talking about, I'm hearing what you're asking is talking about apples and oranges.
Well, Dr. Cotton, would you agree that if this particular proficiency test was a real case, that the statistic of 1 in 1.8 billion would be irrelevant if, in fact, you knew it was a false match between 59 and 57?
Objection argumentative, also asked and answered.
Overruled.
Yes, it would be irrelevant.
Thank you. Now, after you got this false positive in this series of proficiency tests in 1988, did you make changes in your procedures in an attempt to prevent, or at least to minimize, the likelihood that DNA from a sample could cross-contaminate another sample?
We made changes in our procedures to specifically address the way that this particular contamination occurred.
And did you believe that when you made those changes, that took care or solved the problem?
Well, I think it solved this problem. That clearly doesn't imply that it could solve every possible problem.
But in 1989, the very next year, you participated in the second round of California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors proficiency testing, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
And in that second round of testing, you got another 50 samples, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
And you got another false positive in this next batch, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
Now, this again was caused by DNA from one sample cross-contaminating a second sample, was it not?
That's right.
And did you conduct a full investigation to try and discover what caused this cross-contamination?
Yes, we did.
And in that investigation, did you conclude that the amount of the contaminant which caused the false positive was somewhere between 20 and 50 nanograms of DNA?
Yes, we did.
And in this particular case, Dr. Cotton, this case being the Simpson case, wasn't it your estimate that the quantity of DNA in lane item sample 52 was approximately 25 nanograms of DNA?
It was my estimate that the amount of DNA that's participating in giving that pattern is 25 to 50. The total amount of DNA in that sample was more like 200. And I remember giving an explanation of where those two numbers came from.
But the amount of DNA that's actually in the lane is somewhere around 25 nanograms? Was that your initial estimate?
The amount of DNA that's giving the pattern is between 25 and 50. The amount of DNA handled with that sample in total is about 200.
So the amount of DNA that's 25 to 50 nanograms in that particular item, at least as it appears in the RFLP test, would be within the 20 to 50 nanogram range that you attributed to the cross-contamination in the proficiency test. Is that correct?
That's right.
Now, how did you go about attempting to figure out how you got this false match in 1989?
We went into all the handwritten notes. Two different analysts had done the samples. We spoke with the analysts to find out what samples they had done adjacent to one another. And the reason was, when I say adjacent, that is the test tube rack holds, I don't know, say 15 samples across the top row and another 15 samples across the bottom row. But anyway, about 15 could be side by side. We knew a whole lot of places where we could figure out a whole lot of places where the contamination didn't occur. And we were finally able to analyze that the contamination had to have occurred in the extraction of the sperm fraction. Again, everything was extracted as if it could have a non-sperm and a sperm fraction. It had to have occurred in the extractions of the sperm fractions, and the samples that were involved in producing the contamination were worked side by side. So we were able to eliminate other places where it could have occurred. For example, as you load the gel. It couldn't have occurred as you load the gel because the two samples weren't loaded side by side. So anyway, we narrowed it down to this one section, and then beyond that, we weren't able to definitively say exactly how the contamination occurred. We could just say it occurred in these series of steps.
Now, so what you did, in other words, even after this thorough investigation on your part, was to narrow it down to about what point in time the cross-contamination occurred. Is that right?
Right. What series of steps in the analysis that it occurred.
And you determined that it happened at some point during the extraction process.
Yes, in dealing with the sperm fractions.
But even to this day, Dr. Cotton, would it be fair to say that you don't know how the accidental cross-contamination occurred during the extraction process?
Yes, that would be fair to say that.
And would it also be fair to say that this cross-contamination, this accidental cross-contamination, happened in spite of the fact that all the sample transfers were witnessed by a second person to make sure that no errors occurred?
You are exactly right.
And again, Dr. Cotton, after you got this second false positive, did you make certain changes in your protocol, again, to try and avoid this type of problem from reoccurring in the future?
Yes, we did.
And what changes did you make?
We mandated that the DNA extractions for the known samples could not be done out on the bench at the same time as the DNA extractions from the evidence samples.
Would the DNA extractions from the known samples be put into a different extraction rack than the DNA samples from the evidence?
They simply wouldn't be done at the same time.
They would still be in the same rack?
No, you don't.
I'm sorry, I thought you mentioned before that there's this rack and it might have 15 samples in it or some such number. Did you say something to that effect?
Yeah, I did in talking about the CACLD analysis.
Well, do you also have a similar kind of rack process when you're analyzing casework?
Yes, we do.
So what I'm asking you is, under your current protocol, will you ever have the extraction from the reference sample at the time of extraction sitting in the same rack as the evidentiary specimens?
No, we don't.
Thank you. And based on your experience, Dr. Cotton, and your expertise, would you agree that a laboratory which places the reference sample at the time of extraction in that same rack with the evidentiary specimens runs the risk of falsely incriminating innocent people?
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
All right, Dr. Cotton, would you agree that a laboratory that extracts the reference sample and puts it in the same rack, same extraction rack, as the evidentiary specimens, runs the risk of getting false matches between the reference sample and the evidence?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence, also calls for speculation.
Well, based on our experience and that happened in our lab, then obviously it's possible.
Now, since 1989, there have been no more CACLD proficiency tests, have there?
No, there haven't.
And since 1989, I believe you said you haven't participated in any proficiency tests where you've been asked to handle more than a dozen samples. Is that correct?
Well, I think I said we haven't, the proficiency tests normally have 3 or 4 samples.
So certainly there haven't been any with a dozen.
No, there haven't.
And I believe you also said that in this case you've been asked to analyze approximately 23 samples?
In this case, in total, we analyzed 23 samples. That was done over a relatively long period of time, so they weren't all analyzed. They weren't all received at the same time, and of course they weren't all analyzed at the same time.
And Dr. Cotton, these false matches that you made on these open proficiency tests, they were made during the first 2 years that your laboratory was doing DNA typing?
Yes.
Now would it be fair to say that you've been improving your technique over the last 6 years?
That's the goal.
But I think you also said that you have no control over the possibility of cross-contamination that occurs on samples before you receive them.
Yes, that's obvious.
And in this case, every sample that you received was initially collected, packaged, and processed by the Los Angeles Police Department.
Objection assumes fact, also lack of foundation.
Well, we've been through this series of questions about 5 times now.
It's a foundation question for the next one, and there's no other question on that, Your Honor.
All right.
With the court's permission, I'd just like to ask that one question.
Proceed.
Well, it's my understanding.
Now, since you became involved with the Los Angeles Police Department, have you ever been asked to review the Los Angeles Police Department's procedures that were used in this case?
No, I haven't.
Do you have any personal knowledge, as a professional, as an expert, as to the extent that the Los Angeles Police Department has been subjected to external blind proficiency testing?
Objection beyond the scope, also
Sustained.
assumes facts not in evidence.
Would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that you are more reliable now as a laboratory than you were in the first 2 years of your operation when you made these 2 false positives on the CACLD tests?
Objection argumentative.
Orwell.
I don't know that because we made these errors in the tests that we were unreliable in our other work. I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Cotton. Do you think that you're still getting false positives with the same degree of frequency now that you got them in those 2 proficiency tests in 1988 and 1989?
Certainly, based on our current proficiency test results, we are not.
And do you know, Dr. Cotton, as to how long the LAPD have been doing DNA casework before they did the work in this case.
Sustained.
No further questions of the witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Clarke, are you ready?
Could we take a break, Your Honor?
Okay.
Your Honor, with close permission, I'd like to substitute 1157A, which is the printout,
Yes.
for 1157. Oh, I'm sorry. There's both 1150, a photograph which is 1157, and a photograph which is 1157A.
The one which the arrows are on, correct?
That's correct.
All right.
And
We'll
they're both
add
coming.
1157A in
you.
addition. All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned to you, every time we shift, I'll allow the attorneys time to reorganize their exhibits. Please remember all my admonitions to you. This will only be about, Mr. Clarke, what, about 15 minutes?
Fine, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. Ask the jury to step back into the jury room, please, and we'll stand in recess for 15.
I think.
Certainly. We'll make that defense exhibit 1158 out of the presence, starting my 401st page of notes.
And one other matter, Your Honor, is that we still have this problem with the frequencies on the mixed stains. I'm told by Dr. Thompson that although he offered to meet with the other parties at lunchtime, that offer was rejected. And we have this problem of these numbers. Now, you heard and you received the numbers that Dr. Thompson came up with simply following the NRC method, which is to aggregate the frequencies from the discovery that they gave us.
All right, Mr. Neufeld, let me cut to the chase. Mr. Clarke, what's the prognosis of getting together and seeing if we can agree upon the aggregate numbers?
I just didn't hear the last part.
That we can agree on the aggregated numbers.
What I've been waiting for is if the defense will offer us a set of numbers, and they've done that as to DQ alpha on the steering wheel, I believe, we'll be glad to review them. It hasn't gone any further than that. And I think to say that I rejected an opportunity to meet with the defense is a bit funny, since there's simply a lot going on at the moment. But yes, if they will offer us some numbers, we will be happy to look at them.
Well, the problem is it's your number, so you need to offer it. But
All right.
using this methodology, when do you think you can get us some numbers? Or similar methodology?
Okay, and I'd like to address again the court about that manner, and I don't know if the court wants to take that up by manner, not matter, manner of calculation. Does the court wish to take that up now or following the redirect, recross, etc.? But Dr. Cotton, maybe I can short circuit it. Dr. Cotton has told me, and although we don't agree that this is what should be done, that this method could be done, I believe, in about an hour to an hour and a half. She has to sit down, but we would like to address you about the propriety of which frequency or which approach to use, and we have to do that yet.
Okay. I would suggest then that we continue with the redirect examination and recross. And your indication to me, if I recollect correctly from last week, is that Dr. Cotton will reappear later in the case.
That's possible. That may not occur. Now, counsel for the defense also indicated that perhaps there would be no objection to Mr. Sims making some of these calculations across the markers. That may or may not solve that. I don't know. But the answer is Dr. Cotton will be available. Whether there's a need to recall her or not is
I would
another matter.
I would like to conclude Dr. Cotton for all purposes tomorrow,
Oh,
if not sooner.
all right. One of the problems is the court did not allow Dr. Cotton to calculate the frequencies across even the Department of Justice numbers. So if that comes to pass, then obviously she will be returning if the foundation has to be laid.
Okay. All right.
Just as to these numbers then, Your Honor, I mean, I know that Dr. Cotton said she had to be out of here by Wednesday afternoon. As you can tell, I'm finished with my cross-examination now, so that's not a problem. But I definitely want to leave with the jury during this visit of Dr. Cotton's a sense of just how common these frequencies are.
Well, let's see if we can do this, though. If Dr. Cotton says that she can do this calculation in an hour to an hour and a half, let's see if we can't conclude the redirect, the recross, allow her the remainder of the day and the evening to do these calculations, come back tomorrow morning and see where we are. Let's see if we can do that.
That's certainly fine. Thank you, Your Honor.
Could I have just a quick moment, Your Honor?
Sure. But let's see if we can finish this afternoon with everything except those numbers.
Your Honor, it may make more sense that, particularly in view of the fact that Dr. Cotton's not going to be allowed to testify now about the Department of Justice frequencies, that we will want to bring her back for that purpose. And therefore, can we take care of all of the frequency matter when there's more time to address it appropriately?
All right, well, let's see how far we get today.
All right.
All right, let's have the jurors. Gentlemen, please be seated. Record should reflect that we have been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Dr. Cotton, would you resume the witness stand? And Mr. Clarke, you may redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Cotton, with regard to these proficiency tests that you were asked questions about earlier today, can you estimate for us or otherwise tell us the number of proficiency tests that your laboratory has taken since 1989?
I made a count, assuming I counted correctly, since beginning in 1990 till the end of 1993 comes to about 104. And there have been ongoing tests in 1994 and continuing into 95, but they're not reflected in the documentation I have with me, so I didn't include those.
Now, is that just the number of different tests that the laboratory has taken, proficiency tests?
That's right.
And I believe you said that was through 1993?
Yes.
Is there any way you can estimate the number of tests, for instance, in 1994?
Objection, hearsay, and discovery.
Oh, well, excuse me, sustained on the as to speculation, asking to estimate.
All right. With regard to these, and I'm sorry, what was the number again since 1989 through 1993?
I counted 104.
How many different samples? Do you have a count of the total of number of different samples that those 100 plus tests included?
Yes, I do.
How many is that?
466.
Of those 466 samples since 1989, that is proficiency test samples that have been tested, how many errors has the laboratory made?
There are no false positives and no incorrect exclusions in the remainder of those samples since 1989.
Since 1989, has your laboratory made or have they typed any false positives in any test?
Well, I can only tell you what we're aware of, and
Objection. It's speculation at that point, Your Honor.
Well, we'll, you
obvious.
said only what I'm aware of. That's not speculation. Proceed.
No, I would just ask for clarification. Is this for proficiency testing?
Proceed.
I'm sorry, could the witness be allowed to conclude her answer? I believe she was in mid-sentence.
Yes, she was.
The only measure we have of a false positive or a false exclusion is on a proficiency test. I obviously cannot tell you in a case because we, as was pointed out earlier, we don't know what the result is supposed to be. I can't tell you whether in the number of cases that we have done, whether there are any, because although it's possible you would be able to pick it out, it's not a guarantee that you would be able to pick it out by any stretch, and therefore I can only tell you in reference to the proficiency tests, and I can't tell you any further than that.
Perhaps I misspoke. Actually, I was addressing myself only to proficiency tests and those tests that you've taken since 1989.
There are no additional false positives, and there are no incorrect exclusions in the proficiency tests since 1989.
Incidentally, as far as this area of proficiency testing, what role, if any, did your proficiency tests have to do with your accreditation by the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors?
Like the Twigdom guidelines, the ASCLD lab requires that each analyst take 2 tests per year, and one of them must be from an ASCLD approved proficiency test provider, and we must sign documentation agreeing with that we will give those results back to a committee, back to ASCLD. It's a committee within ASCLD lab for their review. So not only are they being reviewed by our laboratory, but they're being reviewed by ASCLD.
Was this, or did these proficiency tests play any role in your accreditation process?
If we had not been doing the level of proficiency testing that we have, our lab would not have been accredited.
And it was accredited, is that right?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to change topics too, and do you recall a series of hypothetical questions asked you by Mr. Neufeld about various swatches taken from the Bundy crime scene?
Yes, I do.
And in particular, do you recall being asked questions about the various blood drops, starting from the drop closest to the victim's bodies, number 47, through and including the remaining drops, 48, 49, 50, and then finally 52 out in the driveway area?
Yes.
Do you recall his questioning you about the possibility that each and every one of those samples was cross-contaminated by contact with swatches taken at a different scene, namely the Rockingham home?
Yes, I do.
First of all, how can DNA get from one swatch onto another swatch by contact?
If both swatches were wet and they were in immediate contact with each other, presumably because they were wet, you could have some exchange of material. If they were dry, that would be harder, and you might have to have sort of an excess of material on the swatch such that some was basically sort of flaking off, but it would be harder if they were dry than if they were wet.
Now, I believe you described during your cross-examination that that type of transfer from one swatch from one location that is seized at one location to another swatch seized from another location was scientifically possible. Is that right?
Yes, I can't say that it's impossible.
Would it be the case, and first of all, you have already testified about various results from the Bundy crime scene, is that right?
Yes.
That included this series of blood drops, items 47 through 52?
Yes.
Except for item 51, I believe, was not one of those particular samples, correct?
Yes.
And you described, for instance, typing results from the shoe print, which is item 56?
Yes.
As well as the boot drop, item number 78. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to use the Bundy results board at this time. And I believe that's People's Exhibit 259.
Deputy Smith, why don't you grab that other threat button? I think we need it up just a bit. Great, thank you.
Now, Dr. Cotton, can you see those results without, we won't be going into the individual types and their results, but can you see basically each of those item numbers beginning with 47 from where you're seated?
No, I better step down.
Well, let me just try it a different way.
Okay.
Let's start with item number 47, the first drop by the victims. And what I'm going to ask you is, for the hypothetical, this hypothetical possibility of a transfer occurring from one set of swatches seized at one location to these particular set of swatches, would it be correct that these individual items, first of all, would have to be collected? In other words, collected by some evidence collector at the Bundy crime scene. Let's start with item 47.
Yes.
For that hypothetical to be true about this cross-contamination, would the DNA in that particular sample, again, the first drop by the victims, number 47, have to degrade to the point that you could detect no DNA whatsoever, even by PCR?
Yes.
Would that item, in terms of these swatch or swatches for each individual item, then have to come into contact with these swatches from a totally different scene and a different item number?
Yes.
And again, what type of contact would be needed for this to happen?
Very close contact.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they'd basically have to be right on top. They'd have to be touching,
Physically touching?
physically touching.
Is touching enough, or does something actually have to physically happen from one swatch to the other swatch?
Well, let's put it this way, touching is the minimum.
What actually has to transfer from one swatch to the next swatch for this hypothetical to actually be true?
Well, given that the swatches are bloodstains, white blood cells have to transfer. I mean, you wouldn't have just white, but you'd have to have blood cells transferring off one swatch and on to the other.
What would have to be the quantity and quality of these cells that have gone from one swatch to the other swatch so that you could only detect the material that transferred?
The material on the swatch from which the contamination was coming would have to be of sufficient quantity and quality to do the testing, to appear on the final test. So given that one now had completely degraded so you couldn't test it, you'd have to have enough transfer from the other swatch, enough DNA of sufficient quality to be able to now see it on the test.
And then ultimately, and you've described that final step, ultimately for this hypothetical to be true, you would have to then go through a typing process and only detect the types from the swatches that supposedly cross-contaminated, for instance, item number 47.
Yes.
Now, would that same occurrence for this hypothetical to be true have to have happened to item number 48, the next Bundy walkway drop,
Yes.
as well as 49, the next drop,
Yes.
50, the next drop,
Yes.
and 52, the next drop?
Yes.
Now let's talk in a little bit more detail about item number 52. What do we know about the quantity and quality in item number 52 in comparison to 47, 48, 49, and 50, the earlier drops on the walkway?
We know that the quality of the DNA in 52 is sufficiently good to give an RFLP banding pattern. That is, some of the DNA is good enough to do that. And you can see on the mini gel that it's much better than the 49 and 50, which were also run on mini gels. And then as far as 47 and 48, that was not good enough either. So basically 52 is in much better shape than 47, 48, 49, and 50.
Does that mean the DNA transferred by this hypothetical from another swatch at another scene to the material in item number 52 would have to be some amount and quality of DNA in excess of the remaining drops?
Yes.
Is there any way to describe that difference in how much and what the quality of the DNA would have to be?
Well, in terms of quality, it would, there is and I have a very good recollection of what 49 and 50 looked like for some reason, so I'll just use those as an example. The difference in the level of degradation between 49 and 50 look about the same, and they are very different from 52. In terms of quantity of DNA in those samples, I'd have to go back and into the case folder and look at the amounts and give you a good estimate.
Okay. In any event, it would be greater than the remaining samples, 47 through 50, that would have to be transferred in the hypothetical. I'm referring to the quality and quantity of DNA.
In terms of the quantity, are you saying, is that different for 52 than the others?
Correct. What you were able to actually detect.
In terms of what you can detect, yes. In terms of actual mass amount, it may not be any different.
In other words, the actual size of what was
The
on
actual
the swatch.
weight, that is, of the DNA that you have, which is measured in terms of nanograms, it could be a similar amount in 49 and 50, for example, just that it's very degraded and the other is not.
Okay, now I'd like to turn your attention to item number 56, the shoe print that's also listed on this particular Bundy crime scene results board. As far as that particular item is concerned, is there any indication whatsoever of cross-contamination similar to that on 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52 in terms of DNA type?
No.
Why? What's the difference?
Well, the other 47, 48, 49, and 50 are consistent in type with Mr. Simpson. 56 is consistent in type with Nicole Brown. So if all of those samples were contaminated, they couldn't have all been contaminated from the same source.
Because the types are different, is that right?
Yes.
And in fact, at least one of, and let's take the DQ alpha alleles. Is it true that there is one DQ alpha type that's not even present in item number 56, the shoe print?
You mean that is present in the other samples?
Yes.
Yes.
And what's that?
It's the 1.2 allele.
Now, with regard to this hypothetical, and first of all, well, let me rephrase that question. With regard to this hypothetical, do these unstained controls play any role in determining whether or not this type of transfer could have occurred?
Well, they would if they were out and about at the same time that you're postulating the other contamination occurred, because they don't have any DNA on them, the ones that we tested.
All right, let me put it in the form, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I'm finished.
Let me put it in the form of a hypothetical to you. If those unstained controls, and let's assume there are unstained controls for these various items of evidence, 47, etc., and that those were processed in the same manner as the blood stains, would those unstained controls, in terms of if they detected no DNA, typable DNA, provide you any information about whether or not this hypothetical cross-contamination transfer actually occurred?
Basis?
Well, part of his objection is that the et cetera. I mean, he should spell out which samples he's referring to.
Sustained.
All right. Instead of et cetera, 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52. Do the unstained controls provide you any further information if what I described to you is the case?
Ye-
Objection, assuming facts not in evidence.
If the unstained controls were processed in the same manner at the same time as the actual samples, then you would have to postulate that the contamination only occurred on the actual samples and didn't occur on the unstained controls, so it would be a very specific contamination, not just sort of affecting everything.
And by processed at the same time, do you mean collected, allowed to dry, repackaged, etc.?
Yes, I do.
That's the second time I've used the term et cetera. But through those stages that I just described, including packaging.
Yes.
Do these unstained controls in this case represent, or are they an additional safeguard as to the accuracy of DNA results in this case?
Objection, no foundation for this witness.
The unstained controls tell you one thing. That is that there was no DNA on a spot adjacent to where the stain was lifted from. I don't think they say anything beyond that.
Are these unstained controls, are they to show the presence or absence of bacteria? Is that what you use them for instance?
No, we don't have, I suppose you could test for the presence of bacteria on those unstained controls. We don't.
Objection, I move to strike. Suppose, she's speculating at this point.
We don't have the capability in our lab of doing that.
Incidentally, in your laboratory, in the controls that you tested, that included item number 49. That is an actual unstained substrate control for one of the Bundy walk stains, number 49.
Objection, inconsistent with the testimony.
Can I check my book?
Sure, please do.
There's no designation of 49C, though, as I recollect.
I'm sorry?
There's no designation of 49C.
We received a sample, was labeled item number 49. It was sent to us with other samples that were indicated that they were unstained controls. It didn't have C or control written after it.
And did you test that particular item for its DNA content?
Yes, we did.
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the evidence. Can I have a sidebar?
Overruled. No.
With what result?
It didn't produce any type.
When you say no DNA type, what do you mean?
We got no detectable typable DNA from that sample.
Now, you also tested other unstained controls, is that right?
Yes.
What Los Angeles Police Department item numbers were those?
Item 7 control, item 12 control, item 49 doesn't say control after it. Item 56 doesn't say control after it.
I would move to strike the earlier testimony as the 49 in control.
Overruled.
With what results for the other three? You've already described 49.
No detectable, no typable DNA was present.
Are you aware that any other unstained controls were tested by any other laboratories in this case?
Objection, missing.
Sustained.
Dr. Cotton, I would like to offer you a hypothetical that if, in fact, with regard to these particular items at the crime scene, that is the Bundy crime scene. Actually, let me rephrase that. May I have just a moment, Your Honor? I'd like you to assume that with respect to this particular results board, the Bundy results board, that with regard to each of the items except for purposes of this question, 84A and 84B, that there was an unstained control seized for each of those particular items, all right?
Okay.
That the results of those unstained controls showed no detectable DNA present, all right?
Yes.
Does that information assist you in reaching any opinion about whether or not the cross-contamination possibility posed by defense counsel occurred in this case?
Objection, improper hypothetical, and move to strike.
Sustain.
Now, I'd like to shift your attention, if I could, Dr. Cotton, to questions posed to you about the possibility of a blood tube, that is a tube containing known DNA, could have been spilled or placed or inadvertently mixed with these same swatches, that is from items 47 through 52, the Bundy walkway stains. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
For that to have occurred and for you to obtain the types that you've described, again, would the DNA in these various walkway stains have to degrade so that you could detect no DNA? Actually, let me rephrase that. Be able to detect no DNA types.
Yes.
Would it also be correct for that hypothetical to be true that you would then obtain only the DNA types from this spilled or otherwise contaminated tube blood?
Yes.
If this occurred, that is, these spills or placement from a tube, would you expect these particular swatches from 47 through 52 to have the same quantity, let me rephrase that, to have the same quality of DNA?
There would be a reasonable expectation that if that occurred, they would have close to the same quality of DNA.
Why?
Well, I can think of two scenarios. One is the blood gets on there, it dries, and once it's dried, nothing much happens to it in terms of degradation, in which case you would expect to have the same quality of DNA. The only way I can postulate that that wouldn't be the case would be the blood gets on the swatches and it doesn't dry very rapidly, and therefore something that's already on the swatch then differentially degrades the DNA on one swatch as compared to another. And in that case, you wouldn't obviously expect that they would all be the same.
Did you see, in terms of these stains, the same quality of DNA? This is again the walkway stains, 47 through 52. Or did you see differences in quality of DNA?
Objection as to the word C with respect to the quality of DNA.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Did you detect or did you determine if the DNA quality from these swatches, 47 through 52, was the same or was it different?
It's different.
How? What were the differences?
You can see the differences on the mini gel in terms of how degraded the DNA is in those different samples.
Was there a difference? And let's, if this would help you, let's take 47 and 48. Were there differences between those two? Or if there's a better way of describing this difference, please tell us how.
If you want me to be more precise about it, you'll need to let me get out the pictures so that I can look at them.
All right, if you would.
Okay, we'll give this a try.
Could we start with item 47 and tell us what would be the easiest way to make this comparison between that first walkway stain by the victims and the remainder?
Well, I'll go down item by item and sort of try to give you the level of degradation that we can see on the mini gel versus sort of like not very much, a moderate amount, or a lot.
Okay.
You have to keep in mind that this mini gel isn't assessing human DNA, it's assessing total DNA, and therefore there's I can only tell you what I can see. I can't tell you anything about whether based on this result alone as to what I'm seeing is human or not. Okay, item 47, and again, I'm taking a minute because I have to translate numbers here and also count. Item 47 is very degraded. Item Item 49 and 50 are very degraded. Item 56.
Responsive. It's
Okay.
only limited to the drops, I believe.
What's the night? Am I just
I'm sorry, sustained, correct, it's not one of the bun traps.
okay?
Actually, what I'm going to ask permission to do, Your Honor, is to display to the jury, just briefly, the photographs of each of these items and ask the witness to describe what they mean as far as this opinion.
I mean, the photographs of the actual spots at the crime scene.
No, photographs of the actual test results from determining how much DNA is present.
All right.
Could we do that, first of all, Dr. Cotton?
We can, if you'll give me just a second to pull out what I have to do is give you the originals and then pull out the sheets from my copies that'll tell me what sample's in what lane.
All right.
Your Honor, additional objection, based on her testimony, that a lot of it isn't even human DNA.
Oh,
Only,
excuse me, Your Honor, I believe.
Speaking objection.
sorry. May we have a sidebar on that, Your Honor?
No. Proceed. All right, do you want to show those to Mr. Neufeld as well?
Yes. First of all, Dr. Cotton, do you have copies of these photographs?
With me?
Yes.
No.
All right. Could we, Your Honor, for purposes of this, utilize the originals and obtain copies and at some point substitute them? These are, I believe, are these photographs from your original raw notes?
All right, let's go with the originals today, though.
have given me 2 pages. Which one would show, that is, which page and which photograph would demonstrate item 47, the first drop? The lower photo on a page labeled at the top, August 1, 94 or 8/1/94.
Yes.
I believe that would be 263, Your Honor. It's referring to the photograph.
All right, People's 263.
Dr. Cotton, showing you a photograph that's now on the screen that will be People's Exhibit 263. What's that a photograph of?
It's a photograph of the small mini gel that was used to look at the DNA that was extracted from the samples that were loaded on there.
If I give you the pointing arrow and give you the podium, can you describe for the jury, please, what particular lane we're looking at? And then I'll have you describe what this process actually shows.
Sure.
First of all, Dr. Cotton, with regard to this photograph, what would you call this photograph? What's it of?
It's a photograph of the mini gel using the DNA samples before they were digested with the restriction enzyme.
And what's this mini gel process? What do you use it for?
For looking at how degraded the sample DNA is.
And you ultimately use photography to be able to later review those results?
Yes.
Now, is there a way that you can show us, and let's start with, I'm sorry, item number 47, the first walkway drop. Can you indicate where you would look for results on this photograph?
Let's see. Are we on here? The top of the gel is up here, and you see the best place you can see right here, that little indentation, that's an indentation where the sample was loaded, and so is this, and so is this. And you can't see them quite as well over here, but they go all across the top. So the person who did the work recorded what sample she loaded in this lane and what sample she loaded in this one and so on. And so based on looking at the notes, when you're asking me about a particular item, I'm looking at the notes and seeing in which lane that item was put into the mini gel.
Now, incidentally, is this one of these x-rays or autorads that you had just shown to the jury last week?
No, this is actually a photograph of this small gel, which is about 2 inches by 3 inches. And the gel is sort of opaque, and you can see the edge of it right here, this black. This was a full-size picture. That is, it had a lot of extra nothing out here black, because this gel is laid on a light box, but instead of the white light that you see on the light boxes that have been used so far, it's an ultraviolet light box. And because the DNA has been stained with a dye, if you were to look at this in color, the places where you see DNA sort of appear a pinkish orange. And the gel has this sort of opaque look. And then before it's put in the case folder, the gel is just trimmed out, and the rest of the picture that doesn't contain a gel or anything else is just thrown away.
How do you read this particular photograph to determine approximately how much and what quality of DNA is present in a sample?
The photograph is, you can look at it and think about it just in exactly the same way that you think about the DNA on the autoradiograph. The DNA was put into a sample well up here, and it moved down in this direction through the gel. And these are 3 controls that are on the gel. This is the same lambda that's loaded on the large gel that we produce the X-ray film from. So this is 100 nanograms of lambda, and this is 50, and this is 25, and it has the same bands that you would see. And the reason this is on there is that we know the size of this top band is 23,000 base pairs, and what we're looking for is if DNA is in good condition, it will be up here because the pieces will be very, very large. As the DNA is more degraded, then you'll begin to see DNA down here.
Why is that?
Because as it gets more degraded, the pieces are randomly broken up and all of the pieces get smaller and smaller and smaller. So you can see that the DNA in these lanes, and what you're looking at now is if you were looking at it on the light box, it would be a coloration. Here it just appears white because this is a black and white picture. So you're looking at the distribution of the stained DNA from the top to the bottom of the gel. And if you see it all along, then you have some degradation here. To give you an example, this sample right here, whatever it happens to be, does not appear to be very degraded at all. It looks very, very good.
Let's take the 3, and I believe you described them all as lambda markers, the far right-hand 3 lanes that have a series of bands in each one.
Yes.
Those are controls in this test?
They're controls just to say your gel ran as it should and to give us a sense of amounts of DNA, although this is not a real quantitative control. Some other laboratories use a known amount of human DNA in these positions instead of this lambda, and that's actually works a little more nicely in terms of quantitation.
Let's go left to right if we can, and let's just go to the first lane on the far left. Can you show us where that is?
Right here.
Now, what's in that lane in this test?
Item 78.
And that would be the boot drop, is that right?
Right. Obviously, it's the DNA from item 78.
What kind of condition was that DNA in?
Well, it looks pretty good. There's not a lot of it, but I see DNA here, and I see a little bit of a smear coming down, but it looks like it would be good enough to load on an RFLP gel.
In other words, from this result, in terms of the relative quality of the DNA, it appeared that an RFLP test might produce results?
Yes.
And was that decision, in fact, made as to the boot drop?
Yes.
And that produced the RFLP results that you described last week, is that right?
That's right.
What's in the next lane?
The next lane over is item 56.
That's the shoe print?
Yes.
And I believe last week you described that from this evaluation or mini gel or yield gel, first of all, are those all terms used
Yes.
to describe this photograph and these results?
Yes.
You described that it appeared that that would be enough DNA to be able to obtain an RFLP result.
Yes, it certainly looked like it, because you see there's a lot right here.
And that turned out not to be true because of the condition of the DNA, that is, what type of DNA itself it was. Is that right?
It turned out not to be true, and we're now making a judgment call that it wasn't true because the DNA that we're seeing is not human. If this were human DNA, we would have seen a very nice RFLP pattern.
Now going to the next lane, can you point where that is?
Yes, right here.
What was in that lane?
This is item 52.
Item 52 was the last blood drop out in the driveway area at Bundy.
Yes.
What did this result tell you about that blood drop?
There's some DNA in this high molecular weight area, but you can see if you follow this down that there is some DNA that's all the way down in here. So this sample is degraded, and if you only had this to look at, I mean, now we know that it did give an RFLP pattern, but at the time that we looked at this, the assessment was it might not. So we loaded it, but we didn't know if it would give us a result.
You have described earlier, and I believe as to 3 of the drops in this trail, that the DNA was very degraded when I asked you on the witness stand.
Yes.
How would you characterize the result, or the condition rather, of the DNA with regard to 52, that blood drop in the driveway?
Sort of a medium amount of degradation.
Okay, what's the next lane over to the right?
Next lane is item 7 from Rockingham.
In the Rockingham driveway drop? One of them?
Yes.
Okay. And since we're going to stick to the Bundy scene for the moment, what about the next lane over?
The next lane over is 47.
Now, tell us about 47 and what you see there.
What you see here is that there is no DNA that's visible in this upper area. So from that, you would assume that you are not going to get an RFLP pattern from this particular sample. You can see some DNA down here. You see this smear that starts about a little more than halfway down and goes all the way to the bottom. If that's human DNA, that's probably going to be good enough to give a PCR result.
And that's in fact the technology you used to type that particular item?
Yes.
And for the moment, what is in the next lane?
The next lane is item 12.
And that was the Rockingham foyer?
Yes.
And what result in terms of the presence of DNA can you determine from this particular test?
You can see a lot of DNA right at the top, a little bit of degradation in here, but not a lot. And assuming that this is human DNA, you would expect that it would give you a very nice RFLP pattern.
And did it do so when you conducted your RFLP typing?
Yes, it did.
Now, incidentally, before we move on, Dr. Cotton, this particular test, that ultimately you received the photographs from, this yield gel, I believe you used that term,
Yes.
that's done after you actually extract the DNA in your laboratory?
Yes.
And these were all extractions that your laboratory did of DNA from the actual swatches sent to you from Los Angeles?
Yes.
Okay. Now, could we move on to what would be the next photograph to go to? The same page that's
No,
currently?
the other page.
The other page? All right. And Your Honor, could this photograph be marked as People's Exhibit 264?
264.
All right, Dr. Cotton, do you have that second page, or?
I do.
Okay, thank you. And Your Honor, may this photograph also be placed on the...
Yes. Have you shown that to Mr. Neufeld?
Yes. Now, Dr. Cotton, is this another yield gel?
Yes.
And does it show results as to any of these samples taken at the Bundy crime scene?
This one has the samples from 49 and 50.
Could you point those out to us?
These are the same controls I just mentioned. 49 was in this lane and 50 was in this lane.
Let's start, and again, first of all, were these samples run in your laboratory on a yield gel after your laboratory extracted DNA from these original swatches?
Yes.
With what results? Could you show them and describe them, please?
Both these samples are degraded to about the same extent. You have to look way down here in the bottom and you see a smear of DNA here, and you see a smear of DNA here, and you see nothing up in this range here. These 2 samples clearly are not good enough for RFLP testing.
And were they then tested using the PCR method
Yes,
with the results that you described last week?
yes.
Now, amongst these, first of all, have we now shown each of 47 through 50 and 52,
Yes.
each of the blood drops? All right. Your Honor, then perhaps we can remove or ask the witness to retake the stand, and I'll ask her further questions.
All right.
Now, having shown these 5 samples, 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52, were you or can you summarize any differences in their relative amounts of DNA as revealed by these yield gels?
She actually asked and answered. That was the question immediately before this.
You can get a general idea from the gels that the amounts of DNA are pretty much in the same ballpark with the exception of 56. But again, because this isn't a measure of human DNA, this isn't a very good place to try to get quantitation as to a precise amount.
Okay, let's turn to human DNA then with regard to these samples. What can you describe about that?
That determination was made on a slot blot, and that's another page of notes.
Okay, is there a way that you can describe those results for us from these various items, 47 through 50 and 52?
From the slot blot?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Can we address these in order? That might be easier to follow. For instance, item number 47.
That's easier for you.
Would it be easier for you in a different order? Okay. Let's start with the one that's easiest to get to then.
Why don't you pull the microphone closer?
Oh, sorry. This quantitation is done from the PCR extraction. And the various amounts of DNA, what kind of answer are you looking for? You want nanograms or you want like plots and not so much?
What would be the easiest way to describe any relative differences between these 5 drops?
Well, I can tell you which ones had the most, which had a middle amount, and which had nothing that we could detect.
All right, why don't you do that?
Okay. The samples that had the most DNA were 50 and item 52. The samples that had moderate amounts were 49 and 12, which I know that's not on the...
12 was from the Rockingham residence, right?
Right.
Okay.
And then the samples that had no detectable DNA on here, which doesn't mean they don't have any, but it just means we're not detecting it, would be 56.
Sustain.
Oh, okay.
I believe you've described 49, 50, and 52 thus far. Can you describe for us 47 and 48?
Yes, 47 had no detectable. And for item 48, I think I have to go to another. Film. Where can I find that? I think I have to go to another film.
All right. Is that something that you can retrieve from your folder?
I can, but I have to go back and figure out what sample number of mine it is.
You're looking for item number 48, is that right?
Right.
Would that be your item 12?
Yes. And 12 also had no detectable DNA.
I'm sorry, was that, when you say 12, what LAPD
That's
item?
my number 12, your number 48.
You described Los Angeles Police Department item number 12, the Rockingham foyer, as having a moderate amount of DNA, is that right?
In my scenario, I think it was a moderate amount, you're right.
Before we move on to a different area, are these differences that you've described amongst 47 through 52 consistent or inconsistent with cross-contamination transfer of DNA as posed by Mr. Neufeld in his hypothetical?
Objection, no foundation, it's pure speculation at that point.
Sustained.
Does the relative amounts, well, let me rephrase that. Do these results of the relative amounts of human DNA differ amongst these samples along the walkway drops?
Yes.
Does that tell you anything, or does that lead you to any opinions or conclusions about whether or not that DNA was transferred from other evidence items as opposed to being DNA collected in the locations as described?
Objection, again, no foundation, pure speculation.
Rephrase the question.
Could I have just a moment?
Sure.
Dr. Cotton, based on these differing levels of DNA in these various items, does that lead you to any opinion about whether or not the DNA detected in your testing is from material collected at a crime scene versus material transferred from stains during evidence processing?
Objection, no foundation, purely speculative.
It looks to me like if it was a transfer, it would have had to been subsequently affected by the swatch it was transferred to. Otherwise, you have to postulate that if it was a transfer, it wasn't from the same thing. It wasn't all from the same tube of blood or all from the same swatch, because they're all different.
Well,
Now, I'm going to shift topics, Dr. Cotton, if I could. You were asked a number of questions about packaging evidence items. Do you recall that?
and I sustain most of the objections to those questions.
All right.
Or vaguely.
I'm not sure if I want to ask the next question or not.
Let your conscience be your guide.
Let's turn to plastic bags. Do plastic bags play any role in preventing cross-contamination?
Yeah, of course they would.
How?
If you have one sample in a plastic bag and you have another sample in another plastic bag, it would be hard to get material from one sample onto the next sample.
When you discussed and you were asked a few questions just this morning, it may have been this afternoon, but I think it was this morning, about DNA when you're talking about a blood stain is looking at or actually detects DNA that's contained in white blood cells. Is that right?
Yes,
DNA is not contained in red blood cells?
that's correct.
You were also asked about some conventional serology techniques that type proteins, such as, and I believe the slide actually had EAP on it. Is that right?
Yes.
Where does that protein obtain from in a blood stain? Is it the white blood cells or something different?
For EAP, it's red. I believe it's red blood cells.
Now let's take, so it's different. In other words,
It's a different cell type.
red blood cells versus white blood cells for DNA. Is that right?
Yes.
In a blood stain, and let's just take a blood stain left at a crime scene, do the red blood cells go to some different location than the white blood cells, or are they mixed?
They're all mixed.
In other words, are they all floating around until a piece of blood is deposited on a surface?
Yes.
What happens to the cells at that point, once a blood a blood drop is left on a surface of any kind?
I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, let me focus it in a little bit if I can. Is it the case that those cells, white versus red, go to different locations in the blood stain, or do they stay mixed?
The blood is a mixture of cells and proteins and other things. I think for most practical purposes, you can think of it as a homogeneous mixture, so that when the blood is deposited, it would still stay a mixture. I mean, cells are very tiny, you know, they're just going to be distributed in the blood stain, white and red together.
Now, I'm going to shift your attention again to just briefly about evidence that you received from the Los Angeles Police Department. Did you receive any extracted DNA from the LAPD?
No.
You received only evidence items themselves in the form of swatches, bloodstained swatches, or unstained controls, as well as known samples. Is that right?
From LAPD, yes.
Where did you get any extracted DNA from?
California Department of Justice Lab.
As far as all of the Los Angeles Police Department evidence items, were all of the extractions done in your laboratory that were received by your laboratory, the evidence items?
Yes.
Now I'd like to turn your attention, if I could, to a particular control that was described earlier today and in the course of your PCR testing, wherein there were some detectable DNA types. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
First of all, that control, what kind of control was it?
It was a reagent blank control.
And that's one of the controls you used to ensure that the test worked properly in a PCR test, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us what evidence item number or numbers that particular control was a part of that same test?
Yes, and I may have made an error this morning. Let's go back here. That reagent blank control was started with, shall I just read the list?
Well, first of all, what item, okay, how many, yes, if you would, that's probably the best way.
Item 78, item 56, item 52, item 7, item 47, item 12. That control was started with those items. It was processed through with those items, and 2 of those items were also, two of those items didn't give any amplified product and were concentrated. After the concentration, one of them gave amplified product, and the reagent blank gave 2 faint dots. And the sample that was concentrated and then gave amplified product was item 56. And this morning, I think I was saying it was item 7, and that is not correct.
Now, these 2 faint dots that you've just described, did their existence affect the typing results of the items other than item number 56?
In our judgment, they did not affect the typing results because, okay, think of, you do the extraction and you start the control. You bring it along and you type the samples and you type the control. For those samples that typed at that point, the control did not show any faint dots. And therefore, we interpreted those samples. So that was a judgment call on our part. 2 of those samples were then, going forward now, 2 of those samples were then concentrated, and one of them gave a type. And the control gave 2 faint dots. So it isn't that you have a whole type in the control, but you do have 2 faint dots. We made a judgment to report those results because the dots in the reagent blank were faint. Now, whether we typed that sample again at the point before it was concentrated, that is when I say the sample I'm now referring to, item 56, is something I'd have to look up because I was getting confused this morning.
Okay. With regard to the earlier samples, that control showed no reactions whatsoever with DNA types. Is that right?
At the first time that it was run, the controls showed no reaction. It did not show any reaction until it was put through the microconcentrator.
Okay, let's talk about why, in your view, is it appropriate to type those? That is, to report the results from all of those items that were a part of that control when that control showed some faint DNA detected when you concentrated it.
Let's take the worst scenario and assume that the contamination was in that control from the beginning and also in the sample from the beginning. If that contamination is so small as to not produce a typable result of any kind, whether or not it's there, it can't have affected the results.
All right. As far as the later typing of item number 56, why is it appropriate to report the results when it in fact showed that small or faint detectable level of DNA?
That's the question to give you the best answer. That's what I was confused on, whether or not we typed that sample again. And it might take me a minute to find that in the notes.
All right. Do you think it would take long, or would you prefer to do it when you have more time?
I'd actually rather do it when I have more time if you gave me a choice.
With regard to the remainder of your tests, was there any DNA detected in any of the other controls?
No, there wasn't. Well, in the positive controls there was, but in the negative controls there was no DNA detected in any other negative control or any other reagent blank control run alongside any other sample that we did.
In other words, the remainder of the negative controls showed nothing as far as controls not expected to show DNA.
That's right.
Incidentally, you were shown a portion of your laboratory protocol today, is that right?
Yes.
And I believe you were asked about a specific page that dealt with controls and decisions that are to be made based on, for instance, a negative control failing.
Yes.
What is a failed control, or a control that failed? What does that mean?
It's relatively vague. I mean, it's in the standard operating procedure, but I have to admit that that's a vague. Basically, if you have any detectable DNA, you could say the control, I don't like this word, the control failed. If you have detectable DNA on that control, the control told you what you wanted to tell you. It told you you might have a problem. It also may be telling you that you shouldn't interpret the results, that you should call them inconclusive, that you should do it again, or you should think carefully before you give an interpretation.
As far as that control, and I believe you had started to describe earlier today about discretion in the laboratory, is that right?
Yes.
On that particular page of your protocol, is there a provision giving PhDs discretion to make certain decisions?
Yes, we always, I mean, you would certainly want to do that. There's no way you could write a standard operating procedure that could describe every circumstance for every test that you could ever get. So if you don't allow room to use your judgment in analysis, then you wouldn't be giving the best possible analysis.
Do you exercise that discretion as a result of your education, training, and experience as a DNA analyst?
Well, I do, and the other lab staff that are involved in the testing do as well.
With regard to this particular negative control that showed this faint DNA present, did you utilize your discretion to determine that those results should be reported?
Yes, we did.
Incidentally, does your laboratory report results according to who's paying for your services?
Of course not.
In your laboratory, is there an approximate percentage of number of cases in which, for instance, suspects are excluded?
Yes.
What is that approximate percentage?
The approximate percent of cases in which we have an exclusion is about 30%.
I'm sorry, about what?
About 30%.
What does that mean when you report approximately 30% exclusions?
Actually, on the scope of cross-examination.
So we've lost credibility. You can answer the question.
It means that we've been asked to compare a victim or, let me back up. It means we've been asked to compare a known sample with an evidence sample. And if the known sample doesn't come from the evidence sample, then they are excluded as being a contributor. So depending on the nature of the evidence and the question that somebody else cares about, that can be an important piece of information.
Do you in your laboratory report results excluding certain suspects and report those results to prosecutors who have asked you to do testing?
Yes.
You have described, Dr. Cotton, the fact that in your laboratory you don't test all genetic markers that are used in forensic science. And let's take an RFLP test, for instance. Is that right?
That's right.
Why is that?
We use 5. We feel that that provides for the great majority of cases a sufficient amount of information to, that additional markers would sort of be like icing on the cake. Now, there are circumstances where more is necessary, in which case you'd have to go to another lab to get more. But for the most part, 5 markers, or if you did 5 markers in the PCR markers, you have a very good amount of information there.
For instance, and let's take item 52 as an example, how many total genetic markers on that Bundy driveway stain did your laboratory test at?
5 RFLP markers and 6 PCR markers.
Or a total of 11 different genetic markers?
Yes.
Dr. Cotton, if you could, I'm going to shift to one other area briefly. Could you tell us what LAPD evidence item numbers your laboratory actually performed the extraction and then typing process on? Can you list those for us?
Sure.
Okay, could you do that, please?
What items we analyzed?
Exactly. Actually extracted the DNA and then typed. In other words, you received an item of evidence, a swatch, and then extracted the DNA and then typed it.
Haven't we already asked this question in a
I
different
have
way?
I'm sorry, I have in total, but not by individual item number, if I could, Your Honor.
All right.
The easiest way, I guess, for me to do that is to go through the report, or to, move through the reports to do that.
Okay, can we do that in relatively short order or not?
It should be easy.
This is beyond the scope, too.
As long as you don't want it in some special order.
No, you can just list us the numbers. That would be fine.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes.
Item 49, item 50, the 3 blood exemplars which were labeled to us as C1, C2, and C3. Items 7, 12, 49, 7, 12, 47, 52, 56, 78. I think I already said 49 and 57.
Yes.
If I didn't already say 56, that's in there. If I didn't already say 48, which I think I did, that's in there.
Did you say item number 48 also, Dr. Cotton?
Yes. And then the 4 unstained swatches, number 7 control, number 12 control, number 49, and number 46.
Your Honor, I'm going to repeat, if I may, in chronological order, what I believe to be those numbers. Would that be acceptable to the court?
Yes.
C1, and please stop me if I have any of these incorrectly, Dr. Cotton. The 3 knowns, C1, C2, and C3.
Yes.
Then items number 7, 12, 47, 48, 49, 50, 52, 56, 78, and the 4 unstained controls, 7, 12, 49, and 56.
Yes,
Does that sound right?
that sounds right.
And those were items that Cellmark actually extracted and then typed.
Yes.
Now, if I may, Dr. Cotton, I'd like to turn your attention to the area of population frequencies. All right?
Yes.
Why is it that you can test and use in your databases, say, 400 to 600 people, and yet be able to make statements about rarity of types that obviously are not only higher than 400 to 600, but are in the millions or even billions?
It's actually twofold, Your Honor. One refers to facts that are contrary to her testimony as to the size, and 2, there's no
Sustained
foundation as to
phrase
this
question.
witness.
With regard to the number of individuals in your databases, approximately how many are there total?
Somewhere around 500 to 600 total.
You utilize those databases to to report population frequency data, is that right?
That's right.
And you've in fact done that in this case, is that right?
Yes, we have.
As far as these RFLP results, several of them are in the millions or even billions, is that right?
Yes.
How can you take numbers of 400 to 500 to 600 of people in these databases and be able to determine estimates of frequency that are numbers higher than 500 or 600? You understand my question?
I do. Let me give you several different pieces to that answer. First of all, we are relying on work done by other scientists knowledgeable about RFLP alleles, that is, how many of them there are. to give us some estimation, statistical estimation of how large a database is needed.
As to that, Your Honor, I move to strike as to the hearsay representations of other people.
Overruled.
Secondly, keep in mind now, it's impossible to test everyone, and it is actually relatively time-consuming to even test 500 or 600 people, given that you can get about 15 people on one gel. You can develop a sample, and make an estimation from that sample, and again, the critical word here is estimation. You could then go out and get another sample, or another group could get another sample, and if this were a legitimate thing to be doing, you could say, does the distribution of frequencies, that is, how often I see a band at 5,000 and how often I see one at 6, and the whole distribution of how often you see a particular allele, does it look like other samples from the same racial group from another part of the country? It will not look the same, but it should look similar.
Objection, Your Honor. Again, I move to strike as to other databases.
Speaking objection. Overruled. Ask another question.
With regard to this process, and you've described now looking at, at other information,
Yes, we do look at other information.
what is that?
Some of the other information has come, well, it's come from various sources. There's information about our probes and our enzyme from a few sources in the United States, from many sources in Europe. There is information that's been compiled for the FBI, by the FBI, a very large amount of information looking at a different restriction enzyme, and a panel of probes, several of which overlap with ours and several of which don't. The overall,
Your Honor, again, I'm going to have to object as to no discovery.
Overruled. Proceed.
You can continue, Dr. Cotton.
No, ask another question. This is a narrative.
All right. You look at other items, and you described a study by the FBI.
say that again?
You've described the fact that you look at other information, and in particular, you were describing a study done by the FBI.
Yes,
Is that a fairly large study?
it's very large.
And what did it look at?
It looked at RFLP databases generated by various laboratories across the country and made comparisons as to the distribution of alleles from databases that were generated in various places for various racial groups.
What's the significance of those findings as far as what I asked you about taking databases and then making estimations that are in the millions or even billions?
Objection, move to strike, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
No, there's absolutely no foundation,
Overruled.
and also no discovery,
Overruled.
and hearsay.
Overruled.
What it tells you is that if you take a database from one part of the country for Caucasians, blacks, or Hispanics, and you compare it to a database from some other part of the country, and you generated a profile frequency, that the frequencies are very, very similar. There are not large differences in the samples from one part of the country to the next.
Objection, move to strike. It is dissimilar, it's too vague.
Overruled.
You have described using RFLP typing at 5 probes, for instance, with regard to the Bundy stain number 52 and the boot drop number 78.
Yes.
When you make these estimations of frequency, and I believe you touched a little bit on a concept called independence,
Yes, I did.
and what is that again?
It means whether or not you inherit one allele that you have does not affect the second allele that you might get. That is, If you inherit a band at 5,000 base pairs, that doesn't mean you'll automatically, or with some probability, inherit one at 6,000. What you inherit from one parent is independent of what you inherit from the other.
Why is that important?
Mathematically, that's important because if that were not the case, it would be improper to multiply the frequencies between the different genetic locations.
How do you, well, first of all, are these markers independent that you've described in your testing in this case?
Objection beyond this witness's, well, no foundation for this witness.
We've gone beyond, we've already covered this once before. And it was not directly touched upon in cross-examination.
I'm sorry?
It was not directly touched upon in cross-examination.
All right. Dr. Cotton, do you have a database for each community of the United States?
No,
Why not?
we'd have to have a lot bigger staff.
Do you
It's
need
not possible.
Do you need a database for each community of the United States to be able to estimate these frequencies?
Objection beyond foundation.
Overruled.
No,
Why?
for all the reasons that I just talked about in the last several questions.
Do those include, for instance, these studies that you've described of groups of people in different parts of the United States and the world?
Objection has been answered in leading.
Sustained.
When you
Leading.
say, I'm sorry?
It's leading.
When you say the material that you've, I'm sorry, when you say specifically for the reasons that you've given earlier, can you tell us briefly what those reasons were?
Objection has been answered.
Sustained. She's already told us what she's relied on.
Okay. These frequencies that you've reported in this case, are they accurate in terms of being precise, or are they estimates?
They are estimates.
These numbers that you've reported, do they tell anything, or do they have any relation whatsoever to the facts of this case? And I'm talking about the facts other than DNA.
No,
Are they estimations only of how common or how rare the various DNA types are that you obtained in your testing in your lab, or all of the samples that you've described in your testimony?
they are only estimates which give you a conceptualization of how common or rare the collection of genetic markers is.
Do they in any manner take into account at all of the other facts of this case that show what happened in this case?
They don't take into account anything except saying, is this collection of genetic types common or rare or somewhere in between? That is the only thing that those numbers tell you. They tell you nothing else.
All right, Your Honor, with the exception of the one area the witness asked to have a little time to look up, I'm concluded with my redirect at this time.
All right.
Can I have 5 minutes, and I will be able to conclude the recourse by the end of the day.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, why don't you step back for a quick break, and we'll hopefully conclude this matter this afternoon. We've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Neufeld.
Thank you. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Cotton.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Cotton, on redirect examination, Mr. Clarke asked you a series of questions concerning relative degradations, if you will, of the different items, or some of the different items involved in this case that Selmark analyzed. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And along with the drops purportedly corrected at Bundy, he also asked you about about item 78 and item 56. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, and I think you said as to item 78 that there seemed to be a fair amount of high molecular weight DNA present. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
All right. And these questions that were put to you by Mr. Clarke were put to you in the context by LAPD on either June 13th or June 14th.
No, I don't know when it was processed by LAPD.
Would you agree as an expert that if in fact item 78 as a collected swatch didn't even arrive at the Los Angeles Police Department on the days when they were initially processing these items, would that change your opinion as to the consequences of the variety and degradation on these samples?
Objection beyond the scope as to this item.
Overruled.
Well, if it wasn't processed at the same time, then all the various hypotheticals about that I was discussing wouldn't be applicable because it wasn't even there.
And also you were asked about item 56. And Dr. Cotton, were you aware of the fact that when extractions of DNA samples were done at LAPD on the 14th, that item 56 was not included in that group?
No, again, I don't know what was done at LAPD at any particular day.
Now, again, Doctor,
I think the witness was cut off. She may have been finished.
I think she was finished.
I apologize,
That's
Dr. Cotton.
all I had to say.
We're trying to finish.
And Dr. Cotton, again, just as I asked you with regard to item 78, assume hypothetically that item 56 was, did not go through the extraction and other processing procedures for DNA typing that the Bundy drops went through on the morning of the 14th. Again, would you draw that same distinction that those hypotheticals wouldn't apply?
Objection beyond the scope.
Overruled.
Yes, I would.
Okay. I think the one thing that you did say on redirect examination is that all those samples that purportedly originate from the Bundy walkway were either very degraded or moderately degraded. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you had mentioned, by the way, that, I'm sorry, withdrawn. On cross-examination initially, you did say that the one table that you could rely on in the NRC report was the table 1-1, which dealt with the DNA content of biological samples. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that in that table in the NRC report, it states that the amount of DNA present in a milliliter of blood is somewhere between 20